So trimming, right? That's what we're here to do today. If you have no back pins in your wheel, which are those like kind of metal screw things that go in that let you put your bat on, right? You can actually use the, I don't know if you guys can see here, it's got a bunch of concentric circles on it. It's a really good, useful guide for trimming, because you want, when you trim, the pot to be in the very center, right? It's almost like when we're throwing the whole time, we're trying to get it in the center. That way we can hit it better with tools. If you do have a bat, you don't have these concentric rings, like that's totally fine. I'm gonna show you like a little cheaty way to find.
The high part, why does it matter if you have pins in your?
Well, because if you have bat pins here and you want to use, like, if there's bat pins, you have to put a bat on it before you use it. Because if you don't, like, trust me, I've seen a lot of people like try to throw on a just wheelhead like this.
On it, yeah, but for trimming.
Even still, like your tools will catch and you'll gouge and stuff. If there's bat pins, put a bat on it, just for safety's sake, right? Because it's also easy to forget that they're there and go like down low here to trim something and like clip it. You know what I mean? So what I usually do when I am going to try to center a piece is I kind of just look at, I let it spin on the wheel. Kind of just look at where I think it's off, right? I also have these concentric rings, so that should help me a bit. I don't know if you guys can see, it's like closer now, closer now, closer now. Wherever it's closer there, I want to move that point towards the center so that I end up with a kind of pretty smooth, like I still have a little bit of wiggle. That could be because my pot's not perfectly round too, so that's a thing to keep in mind. But I just want it to be as close to right in the middle as I can get it, right? Say you are doing this on a bat, you can't use the rings or whatever, right? Say it's like off a little bit like this. And I can see that the whole pot is kind of wiggling, right? What I like to do is everything else we do, we have like two hands acting as like one tool, right? I'll keep this very still and I'll lean into the pot just a little bit at a time. And there'll be one point where the sharp end of this makes contact. You guys see that? Which is this sort of scrapey line right here. Same concept as like, oh, there's not very much space here at the bottom, right? Wherever it scrapes, it's too close to that side. So what I do is I line the middle of that scrape up with myself, and I push that towards the center just a bit, right? And this will yield us something pretty close to center, right? Like the bottom could be a little off one way or the other. You really just need to get it close. We're gonna kind of carve our way into whatever center we like. So like if your top and your bottom aren't quite on the same center, doesn't matter, we'll establish a new one. You just want to get it close. So now that I found that, right, on this pot, I know the rim isn't going to distort. We already like kind of tested that beforehand. I'm going to take a couple lugs of clay. And I'm going to put my hand on here, pressing down, not with a ton of pressure because I don't want to deform my pot, right? And then I'm going to, at a 45-degree angle, push these sort of into the pot. I'm basically making like a claw of clay on the wheelhead so that it's not going to want to move around a ton, right? So I put at least 3 of those. 3 is usually the magic number for stuff. Push down at a 45. I don't want to be pushing straight in because if my lip does have any wiggle to it, I will then deform it there, right? So kind of pushing down at a 45 will help you avoid that. Cool, and that should be good. Now we should be good to start trimming. I do need a trimming tool over there. Would you mind passing me that trim tool over there, Robin? There's a couple tools you use, right? There's like 20 or 30 different versions of this same tool, right? This is just like your regular loop tool. It's got a straight side, it's got a round side. And then this is what I call a pear core. I've heard people call this a bunch of different names. It's basically just like a big fat trim tool. These are the ones that I use the most, right? There's a bunch of like little itty bitty ones for like very fine detail work, but like you can get by with just this tool, realistically. You know what I mean? So what I usually do is kind of in my brain, decide how I want the foot to look on this before I actually do anything. It's kind of like when you're throwing, you really should try to conceptualize what you're trying to make before you just let your hands do whatever, because there's different steps depending on what the final product is supposed to look like, right? So I kind of decide, like, based on this shape, I think I'm going to want a foot ring roughly like here. You know what I mean? And so now I have like a visual thing to look at when I am trimming clay away. So the point of trimming, right, not only is it to make sure you get a flat bottom piece that sits flush on the table, it's also to remove weight, and then besides that, then in removing weight, it will also make it look better, right? Like a more finished pot. So I'm just going to take this and I'm just coming in at a sort of like 45-degree angle from the right-hand side. My middle fingers here are always with some pressure pressing down into the center. That's just to make sure that I'm not putting so much pressure that I throw off the center that I've created. Does that make sense to everybody? So I really do just like, the very first part of this is just removing clay. Like I told you guys before, the bottom corners of your pots are inevitably going to be heavy. So you have like a lot of wiggle room here to take clay away. Not so much here, not so much here, depending on how thick you left that bottom, right? But right here, you can usually get rid of a decent amount of clay.
So satisfying to watch.
Isn't it? Yeah, and like you see how it's like ribboning off? That's what we're looking for, right? Is those kind of like spirally ribbons there. That's how you know you caught it at a good time. So I'm just going to spend some time basically like cleaning up this line that goes from where the pot was to where I started trimming. Realistically, you're only really trying to clean up this bottom third of the pot. The top 3/4 should have, or top third, 2/3, I guess I should say, should be pretty clean based on what you did when you were throwing. Downside to these little ones, right, to these ones with like a littler loop, is you do get sort of like concentric rings a lot of the time when you go up. You can spend some time like trying to clean those up.
What causes, when I've done this last session, I jumped a lot. Like, you know, I got those,
You got,
what are they called?
what's that
Chattering.
called? Chattering.
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 Yeah,
So like
chattering.
if you're trimming and a pot is too dry, it'll start to go like, which is really cool. It's like you can do that on purpose. Let me see if I can try it. That's like a technique some people do, and you need like a dryer pot to do it, where you like, you'll hear like that sound, right? That kind of scrapey sound. And it's hard to see, but if you look, there's like a little like, as far as carved little pieces here. You know what I mean? That happens when your piece is too dry.
So if it's,
That noise, right? And then when I stop the wheel, it's hard to see because it's brown clay, right? But there's a bunch of little, we call those chatter marks. You can do that on purpose. Like a lot of people do that, and that's their like their design aesthetic. If you don't want that, you're probably trimming too dry, or you're not choking up on your tools enough. So for me to make that happen with that tool, I had to kind of very loosely hold it so that it would have room to bounce. If I'm choked up on my tools and have really firm pressure, that doesn't happen quite as much.
I feel like it happens sometimes if you're trimming too fast, too.
Yeah, that could be. That very well could be. And so I'm just going to take, so as far as I was saying before, right, when I was getting those kind of like concentric lines going up, that's when I use this, just because I can get rid of so much material on such a wide, flat base right here, right? So a lot of the time, I just use this to kind of establish what I want the bottom third to look like before the foot starts.
so you're making the foot right now.
Yeah, so basically I'm making the foot right now. So there's a couple things to think about, like A, visually, right? B, it's got to give the pot some lift. C, what I like to think about is how am I going to glaze this? I do really like a foot that when I hold it upside down, I can hold onto it like this. If I had a foot that was sloping this way, that's going to be very difficult to hold. So I do want something that has somewhat of like a little line here, A, for a glaze catch, right? So if I put too much glaze on it, it'll want to pool there instead of running right off. And B, when I try to hold it upside down, it'll make it a little easier for me. Does that make sense? It's basically just a ridge here. So I'm going to actually make that ridge a little bit bigger, or a little bit more pronounced. Yeah, and don't be discouraged when you guys do this, and like if you trim through a pot, you end up with a planter that you didn't want to have. Like, yeah, now you have a cool planter though. Like planters are tight. Okay, so this is roughly what I want my foot dimensions from the outside to be. I'm now going to work on making the actual foot ring the width I need it to be, and getting rid of some clay from the middle here. Okay. So the way I do that is I usually choose a corner of one of these tools, and I'll carve in roughly like there, right? So that means that this part right here is going to be actually how wide my foot ring is. Everything I'm doing too, like please do try to remember, I'm never just like one hand in it. I'm never very like chill or lax when I'm trimming or throwing. Everything is very controlled, two hands working together, two hands is like one tool, right? So now that I've got that corner in, I'm going to take that corner a little deeper. We're still kind of in that stage of like your corner is going to be like deeper than the middle of your pot, right? Because it's hard to throw to where that doesn't happen. So I know I do have some wiggle room here to get rid of a decent amount of clay. So I'm going to do that. Now I need to make sure I get all this clay out of the center here. What I usually do for there is I take that same corner, I start in the middle, and I kind of spiral out to the side. If you like this design too, like some people do that on the bottoms of their pots, you could just leave it like that. Realistically, what we're looking for is if I took a flat edge to my pot here, I want it to sit on the foot ring and not touch in the middle. That's very important, right? So I just need to remove enough clay to where it doesn't hit the middle there. So I'm just gonna keep doing that. After I do the spirally thing, what I usually do is then take the flat edge of my trim tool and get rid of that spiral.
I wish there was a big shelf of leather hard pots.
Practice.
Practice room.
It's really hard, right? Because if you don't catch your pot at the right time, it's like, yeah. One of the hardest parts about ceramics is like, all right, you did this thing. Now wait for it to be ready and then work on
Time
its
it.
turns.
And then you can't go because you have a dentist.
Yeah, right? And then you're like, I guess I'll just throw this pot away because like I have to go make dinner for my kids or, you know what I mean?
Well, the appointment I made up, but it's always something.
And so this is usually just the time where I spend too much time being really finicky with what I want this, this interior, this part to look like. A lot of what I shoot for, especially on a bowl, is I want it to look like if I just put this foot ring on separately, right? So I want it to kind of get deeper in the corner here, rise up a little bit towards the middle, deeper in the corner, so that it looks like one continuous like sort of curve that goes from like the side of the pot all the way around to the bottom and then down to the other side, and I just put a foot ring on top of it.
Can you do that? Can you just make a foot ring and stick it on?
You can. A lot of hand building's done like that, right? Where you just make like the round shape and then you put like a fake foot.
I think there's a hand building and throwing course next.
Oh, that's so weird. There really is,
Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
Yeah, I am teaching a hybrid class because sometimes it's hard because not very many people hand build here. And so I'm going to do a throwing and hand building class so that we can get like sort of the basics of everything done. Just like clay 101 in general.
But I'm signing up if it's not full today.
Do it.
I did it yesterday.
I almost did it and I was like,
So I'm gonna stop being fussy because I could spend like 40 minutes just being like, this angle needs to be just a little bit more that way, which is like super unnecessary.
so question,
Go ahead.
when you're trimming,
Uh-huh.
you know your pot, you've checked with your pin needle.
Well, you did that when you were like throwing,
Right,
yeah. Mhm.
so as you're trimming,
Mhm.
do you have a sense, oops, I'm getting too.
Yeah, so if you ever notice that when you're trimming down, when you're putting pressure, if your pot starts to deform from the pressure of your tool, stop trimming right there, right? Like, even if it looks ugly on the bottom, I'd rather you have like a piece that's like got a little dent in it than an accidental
through.
planter.
Okay.
That said, we can have accidental planters too,
But
that's
you
fine.
can feel it.
You can kind of feel it depending on your how much pressure you're using, right?
Yeah.
You can also tap it to try to listen. The like more of a, I don't know, like thud.
Thicker.
The thicker it's going to be, right? The more it starts to sound like a drum,
Hollow.
is when you can really tell that you're getting close to too much.
Is there a reason you can't use your little needle tool and then scrape it shut?
You could potentially, but like the clay is not as amorphous as it is when you're throwing, right? So like trying to scrape that shut, it seems like more trouble than it's worth when there's
Or
other
put a
ways to
patch
do
on
it.
or something?
Yeah. All right, so I'm just gonna get rid of some of this like little crumbs here. I'm not gonna worry too much about it because I can get rid of that later. I did sort of disrupt what my very bottom looks like here, so I'm just gonna flatten that out one more time. And then usually I just take like a wet finger that I dry most of the way off. And I just kind of round out corners. That way I don't have to worry about it later, or I don't have a really sharp pot. All right, so that I think is trimmed relatively well, so I'm gonna pull these off.
Ain't that pretty.
Lift this off. Another thing I really want you guys to focus on too is before you trim, like hold your pot like this and feel where it's thick, right? So I can see like I'm pretty much the same thickness all the way down to here. And you can feel usually by the lightness. Like your pot should feel lighter than it looks like it should. That's how you know you've trimmed really well. If you pick up a pot that's this size and it feels really heavy, it's probably those bottom corners. And I'll set this on the table over here so you can kind of feel roundabouts what we're looking for weight-wise on a pot that size.